Hello art friends! Today I'm going to show you guys how I illustrate my picture books. Specifically, my newest book that just came out, Rise Up and Write It. If you're new to this channel, hello, welcome. My name is Anoosha Syed and I am a children's book illustrator and character designer for animation. I've illustrated over 20 picture books with some of the top publishers in the world, and these are some of the clients that I've worked with in the past. I get a lot of questions asking about what the picture book publishing process is like and how I illustrate my own books, and so I wanted to cover it all in this little video today. Today I'm going to talk about how I got this job offer, the timeline and schedule, what it's like working with the publisher, and I'll be going in detail through each step of the illustration process, starting from the concepts and character design, to the sketches, to feedback, to final art. Which, by the way, I do this entirely on my iPad on the app Procreate. This is going to be a long video because I'm going to try to cover everything with as much detail as I can, but you can always skip ahead to a chapter that's more interesting to you. Also, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to my channel. I've made other videos talking about my picture book process as well as what it's like being a professional illustrator, and if you have any suggestions for future videos or any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Now, on with the video. Rise Up and Write It is a 32-page picture book written by Nandini Ahuja and published by Harper Collins on January 5th, 2021. The story is about a little girl called Farah Patel living in a neighborhood with very few green spaces who petitions to make an empty lot next to her home into a community garden. But a gravel company has proposed to buy the land to make it into a parking lot. So Farah, with the help of her family, friends, and the entire community, take action to make the garden a reality through letter writing, planning, and activism. I'm really happy that I had the chance to work on this book because I feel it sends a really strong message and encourages children to be the change that they want to see in the world. I also love that we have 4 South Asian main characters. You have Farah herself, her parents, and Mayor Khan. I feel a lot of pride in helping to create books that I personally would have loved to read as a kid, especially as like a Pakistani kid who, you know, like I never really saw books which had people who look like me in them, and so I feel a lot of responsibility in making sure that the characters in the books that I create now are as diverse and inclusive as the world that we live in. This book is also a novelty book. Since it has a strong focus on activism and letter writing, you have 6 pages in the book that are designed to look like envelopes. Inside of each of them is a fun insert, like a letter, a postcard, a sticker, or a poster. It's a really fun interactive element that was so cool to design since I've never worked on anything like this before. There are several ways to get picture book offers from traditional publishers. Some of them include submitting to publishers or contacting art directors directly, which is something I covered in my art directors video from a few months back. Or your agent might source a project for you. But if you have a strong portfolio and online presence, or you're an established illustrator, then someone from the publisher might get in contact with you, which is what usually happens with me. An art director from Harper Collins, who likely saw my portfolio online, emailed my agent with a proposal for the book, saying they were interested in hiring me for this project. If you remember from my agent video from before, I actually don't communicate with the client at this point. All of the conversation is happening between my agent and the publisher right now to keep things professional. When an editor or art director first gets in touch, in the initial email, they would ask for your availability and then send over basic information about the project, like what the book is going to be about, when it's releasing, how many pages it is, what the budget is going to be, the schedule, and including a manuscript for you to read. If you're interested in the project, the publisher will then send over a contract for you to review and sign. Contracts are really scary, and I'll try to make a video covering them another day, but generally a contract is going to include the following stuff. The contract will cover what you are going to be paid and in how many installments, which, by the way, the fee is always going to be a flat fee, and this includes all of the interiors and cover art. The contract will say who owns the rights to the artwork, in which territories, for how long, as well as the subrights. What the distribution is going to be like, the schedule and when things are going to be delivered, what percentage of royalties you're going to receive, if any, and some other details like whether you are going to be allowed to create competing works, illustrator credit, whether you're going to have consultation on the final art, and how they plan to promote the book. However, if you feel like the contract terms could be better, you don't have to immediately sign it. You always have the option to negotiate, like asking for an increase in the pay, discussing royalty, timeline, the rights, how many of the copies of the book you would receive, illustrator credit, and so on. Since I have a literary agent who fights to get me better deals, she and the publisher would discuss back and forth between themselves on these terms until both parties come to an agreement. Sometimes this process can take days, sometimes it can take weeks. Obviously, negotiation is a really tricky subject. It's something that I'm still learning on my own because while my agent deals with publishing projects, I still have to deal with animation, editorial, all of that kind of stuff on my own. And negotiation is definitely intimidating because you don't want to feel like you are going to scare off the client. But it's also important to be compensated fairly for your work. If you guys would be interested in a video about negotiation and what I've learned over the years, please let me know. Anyway, after all of the discussions are done, I sign off on the contracts and finalize the paperwork. The paperwork usually includes the contract from the publisher, filling a form with all of your financial details so you can get paid. And then depending on where you're located, you might have to fill out certain tax forms. Because I live in Canada and most of my clients are based in the US, I have to fill out a W-8BEN-E. At this point, my agent finally introduces me to the person that I'm going to be working with on this book. In this case, it's the art director, and then we get to work. Let's briefly go over the timeline and schedule. Harper Collins first got in contact with me on January 30th, 2020 with their proposal. Discussions and negotiations took about 2 weeks, and I was finally introduced to the art director on February 14th, 2020. For the interior art, they wanted to see the schedules between March 15th to April 1st, and the final art was due on June 1st. This means around 1 month for the sketches and 2 months for the final art. The cover they wanted to see earlier. The sketches for that was due on March 15th and the final art on April 15th, 1 month each. Remember, this isn't the exact amount of time that I'd be given to actually work on this, since you also have to subtract time where the art director is going to be looking over the work you've submitted and giving you feedback. So in total, I would finish the book on June 1st, working on the book for about 3.5 months. This is actually a pretty short schedule and something that the client did mention to me when they first proposed the project to me. In my experience, 6 months is usually the amount of time that I'm given to work on picture book projects. I've had other picture books in the past, including I Am Perfectly Designed, which were also on a tight schedule. Sometimes that's just how the project goes, and it's up to you to decide whether you are able to get the work done in that time. I'm actually a very fast worker, so it's not a problem for me, but if I had other books going on at the same time, it would be difficult to juggle all of those at the same time. Oh, speaking of, usually I am working on 2 books at a time, 3 max. Before we start on interior art, we have to develop the world and the characters that live in it. As a professional character designer for animation, this is actually my favorite part of the whole picture book process. The art director first wanted to see some exploration for our main character, Farah. There isn't any description of Farah in the book, apart from the fact that she's a South Asian character, and so I had a lot of creative freedom to determine what she would actually look like. I came up with 7 initial designs. Submitting 3 to 4 options is usually good enough, but I felt like because there was no description of her, there could be a lot of different directions I could go with her, so I needed 7 to get that all out. When coming up with her design, I tried to focus on her personality. Farah is going to be an optimistic, upbeat girl on a mission. She is smart, determined, and ready to fight for her cause, and I really wanted to reflect that in her design. The publisher liked this option the best, but they did want to see a few changes to it. Things like changing the outfit and adding glasses and so on. When the revision was approved, I had to design some of the other characters in the book, namely Farah's mom, Mayor Khan, and 2 of Farah's friends. Since they're not major characters, I didn't have to do a bunch of variations on them. 1 was enough, and I managed to get it right on the first try. When designing characters, it is important to have some variance in your designs. Farah and her friends all look different from each other, not just in features, but in shape as well. Each of the kid is based off of a shape. Farah is round, and circles are a big part of her design, showing up in obviously her face, her glasses, and like her whole design is very much rounded and soft. Meanwhile, her friends, Steven is triangular and Miles is square. For Farah's mom and the mayor, it was especially important to differentiate them, since they're both South Asian women kind of around the same age, and it can be easy to end up making them look too similar or have same face syndrome. And I definitely didn't want to rely on stereotypical South Asian features. I made sure that mom looked like she was related to Farah, like an older version of her kind of, and then that she shared her round, circular, soft shapes as well. In contrast, the mayor has a much more angular design in her sharp suit, pointed face, and geometric hairstyle. In effective character design, you can immediately get a sense of personality just by looking at the character. You can tell that mom is going to be sweet and bubbly, and that the mayor is professional but still kind. In terms of environment, the story takes place in an urban city neighborhood where mostly working class families would be living in. While this isn't an affluent neighborhood, it's warm and welcoming, and just super diverse, and just a really nice, sweet place to live in. The publisher sent over some reference images, which is always super helpful. The funny thing is that just prior to working on this book, I had worked on another picture book that also took place in an urban city setting, which was I Am Perfectly Designed. So I had plenty of experience drawing dense city environments, brownstones, diverse neighborhoods, all of that. But since this was a new book, I wanted to differentiate the city from my other one and try something new. While my previous city had a lot of autumnal colors, sorry, I keep getting that wrong, has a lot of autumnal colors and realistic looking red and brown buildings, I thought it would be fun to go on a more colorful, stylized route with Farah's city. I wanted the buildings to look super, stylized, geometric, with all sorts of colors, and have it really feel like a warm and welcoming place. Just like a lovely community vibe where you have the apartments squished together and you can imagine kids playing out on the street and old people just gossiping on the steps of their apartment building. If you guys have trouble with designing environments like I do, treat it like how you would design a character. Try to embed as much story and personality as you can with all of these little details to make the environment feel more alive. Anyway, once the character designs have been approved, we move on to the interior art. At this point, the publisher will send over all of the details I need to get started on the interior art. This would be the manuscript, the dimensions, maybe a template to follow, and a PDF file of the book with the text laid out and descriptions that would give me directions on what would go in each illustration. In some book projects, I would get to decide where the text goes, like how I did with I'm Perfectly Designed, but in this one, the publisher arranged it out for me beforehand, and I would just have to draw my illustrations around the text. Of course, I still have the option to move the text around a little bit if I feel like it better fits my composition. I don't know why people always ask about what dimensions I'm working in. Every book that I've worked on has been different, so I don't know how helpful this information is, but I'll share it just in case. For this book, the book trim was 7.75 by 10 inches, but this doesn't include the bleed, and this is for a page, not a spread. I think including bleed, it ended up being something like 8.53 by 10.3. I have no idea. I also work in CMYK at 300 dpi. I'm always really bad at figuring out bleed and dimensions and all of that. The math stuff, I can't deal with it, so usually I'll ask the publisher for a template to work off of, and I'll just open that template directly on Procreate and work directly off of it so I don't have to deal with dimensions and all of that. This book also has 6 inserts that go inside of those fake envelopes that I mentioned before. We had postcards, letters, stickers, and so on, and each of those inserts were going to be in a different dimension as well. I've mentioned this before, but I work entirely on the iPad on Procreate, from the sketch stage to the final art. In terms of what brushes I use, for sketches I love the gouache detail brush from Bardot Brush, and for painting I mainly just use the default 6B pencil brush. I love it so much, I've created a bunch of different variations for it, but other brushes I like are ones from VV Brush, Max Olukny, which I mostly use to just add texture in towards the end. Now let's actually start sketching. Some people start out with small thumbnails. That's not really my style. I like to just go straight into it. Using the descriptions given for each page, I start to loosely sketch out my interior illustrations. These descriptions aren't very detailed and just give a hint to what action is happening on the page. And sometimes there isn't any description at all. There was a lot of creative freedom here, and I was free to interpret the text how I wanted to. Here is one example of how I interpreted the description for the sketch. On this page, we have two spots. Spot of knocking on doors, maybe a row of brownstones, and spot of Farah holding pages, fanned out to see that there are many pages. There are immediately lots of ways that you can draw these concepts out. For the first spot, for example, you could have it as a close-up of a doorstep, or you could have a bunch of mini spots of people lining up, knocking on doors. I like the idea of focusing on the houses themselves and not the characters, and just focusing on like this really colorful, cute little neighborhood, and then having the characters like teeny tiny in the scene. I did this so that we could have a strong contrast against the second spot, which would be totally character-based. Even this spot has room for interpretation. I could have had Farah standing straight, looking straight at the viewer, and she's holding like a large pile of papers. She's just kind of like peeking from the side, and she's looking super thrilled and excited, but also kind of struggling under the weight of all these papers. So that was one route I could have gone. I wanted to do a spot with a bit more action going on. So here I have Farah in mid-walk, papers just like flying behind her like she's in a hurry, with a determined expression on her face like she's gonna get the job done. Sometimes as an artist, you might decide to go in a different direction away from what the art director suggested. In this example, the description and text implies that the townspeople are already inside of City Hall when the spot is happening. I thought instead it could be a bit more interesting if we have the scene taking place outside and you have like all of the townspeople gathering and marching down to City Hall, and then that could be the lead up for the next page, which is when they're actually inside City Hall for the big meeting. I thought that this would really help bring the momentum up for the next few scenes, and then show that the whole community is gathering up together and supporting each other. I always ask the art director first for their thoughts before I try something different from what they ask. Sometimes they don't go for it, and that's okay, but this was a case where they ended up liking it. When people ask me how I come up with the ideas for my illustration, I think the main thing that I focus on is a sense of storytelling. The author of a picture book is a little bit limited in how much story they're able to tell through the text, because picture books generally have a limit of 500 words. So because of this, you can only have so much text in a book, and writers have to be economical about the words that they choose and, tell their stories efficiently as they can and get rid of all of like the fluff and descriptors and other things that you don't really need to tell in the story. Because of economical storytelling, it's up to the illustrator to fill in all of the story that the author is unable to. When the author and illustrator work together and make a good team, the text and the art will complement each other and flow together seamlessly. That's called teamwork. A lot of people think that being a children's book writer is easy, but it takes great skill to create a beautiful story in just a few concise words. That's why it's up to the illustrator to add in as much storytelling as they can within the artwork. Things like, for example, we have Farah's room, but we don't really have any description of it in the text. As the illustrator, I can use that as an opportunity to really make Farah's personality shine through her room, giving hints to her character, like having posters of female role models around, lots of plants, a butterfly mural, because I really wanted a butterfly to keep appearing throughout the book, like some sort of a symbolism or motif. The other thing I try to remember is to create interesting and engaging compositions and layout. As you might recall, there are 3 different types of layouts for illustrations in picture books. My favorite is the spread, and my signature move in my illustrations is that I love to have a sprawling illustration cover over both spreads. I really love that kind of stuff, but unfortunately, the way that this book is set up, we actually only have room for 1 spread, and then the rest of the illustrations in this book are just spots and vignettes. Not my favorite, but it's also important for me to get out of my comfort zone once in a while. Because I can't vary my layouts, I just have to try to make sure that the compositions for each of these spots or vignettes is different, and I try not to repeat any of those compositions. After I complete all of the interior illustrations, I send it over to the publisher for review. These are just going to be low-res JPEGs, no need for PSDs this early on, while I wait for feedback, which is something that happens quite a bit on picture book projects. I usually just work on other books or other short-term projects. It can sometimes take several weeks for feedback, which is why I tend to work on 2 to 3 projects at the same time, just so I don't have any dead time that's being wasted. You do have to be careful about this though, because once in a while, all these projects magically align together, so you're all working at them at the same time, and also all of the feedback waiting stages at the same time. I don't know, sometimes once in a while this happens and it sucks. Anyway, as you can see, my initial sketches are always really loose. I don't think it's necessary to get too detailed at that point, especially when there are going to be so many revisions involved afterwards. After a few days, I get some feedback and I go over all of the illustrations again to fix any changes that they ask for. And at this point, I also clean up the sketches a bit more. It helps the client get a better idea of what the final art is going to be like, since I would also fine-tune the character design here. And also it helps me out because it's easier to paint a scene where the details are more fleshed out than something that's just stick figures, you know? In this book, we have 6 envelopes to design as well as the 6 inserts that go inside of them. Originally, I was really confused in how they worked and how I'm supposed to design them, but the publisher was really kind enough to send over 2 picture books which also use the same concept of envelope inserts, and another friend sent me a book as well as an example. This was really helpful so I could understand what this concept would end up looking like when it was printed out, and I was also able to pick out things I liked about it and things to change when I had to design my own inserts. For example, one thing I really enjoyed was the kind of realistic quality the letters had. They looked like they were handwritten by actual people with actual pen and pencils. I illustrate digitally, but I thought it would be really cool to do the inserts by hand. The envelopes are sent and mailed to different people, and I wanted each envelope to reflect the person sending it or have some kind of unique design for each of them. Otherwise, you end up with like each envelope being like a plain white boring thing and it gets really repetitive. I had a lot of fun changing up the typography for each one and adding little details like stamps and stuff. I designed each of the concepts digitally at first, and then once they were approved, I either painted them digitally or drew them out by hand, using things like pencils, colored pencils, crayons, ballpoint pens, and then adding these extra details of, the texture from a cardboard mailer or washi tape. I don't think I need to show you guys the sketch page since it's pretty similar to the final, so I'll just share what the final art ended up looking like. These are each of the envelopes and their inserts. A letter from Farah to the mayor, written on her dad's office stationery. A petition drawn out by Farah. I had so much fun pretending to draw like a little kid. A professional envelope from a print shop with a poster inside announcing a meeting. A protest sign. An after-school club envelope with a club member sticker inside. A postcard sent from Farah to the mayor. Before I get to work on painting the final art for the interiors, let's work on the cover. Sometimes the cover is done at the very end of a project, so that by the time that you've illustrated all of the interiors, you have a stronger grasp on what the style of the book is going to be like, and then you can refer to any story elements that happen in the book and put them onto the cover like Easter eggs. Sometimes you do the cover first, which is what happened here. This is sometimes for marketing purposes so that they can start promoting the book ASAP. The art director gave some ideas of what could be on the cover, along with 3 possible templates I could use to follow with the title laid out. They wanted to see Farah as the focus of the cover, maybe along with her friends. They wanted to see options with maybe their hands raised holding pencils, you know, with protest signs, papers, petitions, and all of that. I ended up sketching out 4 concepts. Farah holding a pencil and leading a march with her friends. I kind of like this horizontal composition here. Farah as the focus and a bunch of hands raised with pencils and protest signs. This was my favorite of the bunch. Another version of just Farah, but with a city background behind her. And finally, one of Farah and her friends with all their protest material. This was the design that ended up being selected, and I think also the most child-friendly of the bunch. I had a couple notes on the cover design, so I worked to fix those and cleaned it up a bit and then sent over the file, which was eventually approved. And now we move on to color. This is the first pass that I ended up with. Since I'm painting the cover before I do the actual interiors, it's important for me to figure out what the palette is going to be like, since it's basically going to determine what the whole book is going to be like in the future. I generally have a palette that I like working on for all of my artwork. It's not anything fixed, but it's more just that I like working with these colors. I like all my yellows to be mustardy and my blues to be kind of teal-ish and my greens to be like more yellowish than bluish. I don't know. They're just like certain specific colors that I like that I always use on my artwork. I just really enjoy that vintage mid-century look, and I feel like, or at least I try to make my palettes capture that. Some key things I like to do is to repeat colors so it's a bit more cohesive. For example, if Farah's tights are pink, I'll try to incorporate pink somewhere else in her design, like her glasses or her hair clips maybe. Since we're working with multiple characters, I also try to color them as a whole rather than individually, and make sure that when they're all standing together, their colors look good together. I still want repeating colors throughout the team, but I kind of assigned a different main color to each kid as well, giving them their own sense of identity. For the background, at this point I just left it as like a pastel wash, since I wasn't really sure of what I wanted to do, and then I sent this over for a review. Like I said, I work on Procreate and I just export a PSD file and then send it over by WeTransfer. The funny thing is that the art director replied back politely saying like, the colors look a little off. I don't know what's going on here. They look a little weird. And I was like, huh? What are they talking about? Like, what looks weird about it? I think it looks fine. And then I opened up the file on Procreate and like my face just fell. I was like, oh my god. It looked like a mess. And I was so embarrassed. Like in my head, I thought like, wow, the publisher must think I don't know how to work with color at all. It turns out that when I was creating my Photoshop file, I accidentally put like a weird color profile that was like a weird version of CMYK, and it led to some pretty bizarre results. I had to redo the file as a generic CMYK. Like I said, I'm so bad with color profiles. I don't understand them at all, and so I just stick with the generic CMYK. Lesson learned, don't do anything different. Anyway, I sent over the correct file for approval, and thankfully it was mostly good. I just had a couple of small revisions, mainly adding a background and changing Farah's clothes. In the end, this was the cover that we decided on. Since we had the cover art finalized already, we now have an established color palette that we're going to apply for the rest of the interior artwork. I normally don't do a color rough stage. I like to just improvise my colors and figure it out as I'm working on it. But if you want to see what my color rough process is like, you can check it out in my I'm Perfectly Designed video, because I do it in that one. For the painting style of this book, I definitely wanted it to be stylistically interesting. Just in general, this is how my style works. I don't really focus on making sure the perspective is right. I like my work to look kind of flat, like on this page where there isn't a lot of depth in the living room and all the elements kind of look like they're on the same plane, but at the same time you still feel a sense of space. Also, things like changing the perspective twice on the same object. I really like doing that. a head view on top, front view on the bottom. I just think it looks cool. I also really like including lots of patterns in my work, especially a lot of geometric shapes as well. Instead of drawing each individual book in the library with all of those details, I like to imply them with simple shapes. Obviously, these aren't things that you have to do with your art. I just wanted to explain my thought process and how I figure out my style. I mean, as an artist, I still have to understand perspective and anatomy and know what it all should look like when it's correct. But after I understand how it looks like correctly, I try to see how much I can push it stylistically to create more appeal. Remember, you gotta learn the rules before you break them, otherwise it just looks like you don't know what you're doing. When I'm painting, I also like to add in texture whenever I can. My painting style is also pretty flat. Like, I don't do a lot of rendering and shading. It's all mostly one color. So instead, I have these flat colors and I try to create interest by adding in texture on top of it. Things like rough paint edges, paint splatter, pencil lines, and colors layered on top of each other. At the final art stage, I also try to add in little details as well. Remember, these books are going to be for children, and most kids aren't actually reading the book, they're just following along to it through the pictures. Adding in little surprises and details makes it more enjoyable for them. For example, at the scenes in City Hall, I thought it would be really fun for a bunch of people to have matching t-shirts. You can totally imagine in your mind that previously Farah or maybe some of her friends had designed these t-shirts and handed them out and like really added to like this idea of a movement. And another detail that I added, which I thought was really funny, is that one of Farah's friends, he always shows up with like his mom beside him, and the mom is like super pregnant. And then at the end of the book, the mom has her baby, like she's holding the baby. Adding recurring characters, adding in little things to read in the background and Easter eggs are just a fun thing to consider when designing your backgrounds. It's important to keep your characters looking consistent, which can be very tricky. But having reference open is super helpful. I make sure I have those designs on a reference layer for every page so that I can keep referring back to it when I paint the characters. When I draw other interior pages, I'll always refer back to my initial character designs and not my previous pages that I've illustrated, if that makes sense. Because if you keep using your previous pages as reference for your characters, you might end up with like a telephone game situation where like with each page your character gets slightly more and more different until by the end of it they look completely different from your initial design. So that's why I always refer back to my first initial design. Speaking of reference, I love Pinterest. I keep a Pinterest board for every single picture book that I work on and just collect inspiration for the style, reference for objects and characters, and just like anything else that might be useful for the book. I saved a lot of pictures of urban gardens and like city streets and envelope designs, for example, for this book. And I also used Pinterest to search up kids fashion. I'm just going to share a couple of pieces so you can see how I went from the sketch stage to the final. You can see that I do make some adjustments to the artwork that are different from the original sketch if it makes sense to do so. Let's talk about time management as well for a quick second. I had 2 months to complete the final art, which isn't a lot. And so as the artist, it's up to you to determine how you're going to distribute your time. Time management is super important as a freelancer. And if you don't have a plan set up, it can be super easy to end up rushing at the end because you didn't plan properly, especially if you have other multiple projects going on at the same time. Let's do the math real quick. We have 2 months, which means 8 weeks, for 30 pages and 6 inserts, which means that we have 56 days divided by 36 files of art, which gives us 1.5 days to complete each page. I told you, this is a rush schedule. Not taking out any days for the weekend. The good thing is that not all of the pages are going to take me 1.5 days. 12 of the 36 pages are going to be the front and the back of the envelopes, which shouldn't take that long, which leaves us 24 pages of actual illustration. Again, not all of these 24 pages are going to take me 1.5 days each to illustrate. Some will take less time, things like the simpler spots or an insert like a sticker, but some of them might take more than 1.5 days, like my first spread. This is why planning this out at the beginning is so important. You might not have a clear idea of how long each illustration is going to take you, but you can try to make a guess and try to work that into your schedule. So I didn't do this particular method for this book, but recently, with the help of my finance guy husband, I started creating a sort of checklist for all of my more current picture book projects. This is a sort of schedule I made for a 22-page book I did in the fall. It's ridiculously simple. I just mark out each day with an estimated due date. You'll see that some pages are given 1 day, and some are given 3 depending on the complexity. Sometimes I'll finish up a page early, and that's great. Then, I can either continue working on the pages ahead of schedule, or give myself a break for the remaining days until my next page is due. I can also make sure to give the last page a deadline that's a bit earlier than the actual book deadline, just in case I get behind schedule. Since this was a while back, I actually don't know how I structured my days for this book, but I know some people were asking me how long it takes for me to complete each illustration. And thankfully, Procreate gives you the option to see exactly how much time you spent on each illustration you make. However, this number just tells me the total time I spent actually drawing, like my total drawing time, and doesn't include the time that I spent, let's say, taking breaks or researching and pulling up references and so on. So the total time is going to be a bit longer than these numbers I'm about to share. Anyway, on average, smaller spots like these take me about 2 to 3 hours of total drawing time, whereas the more complex pages take about 10 hours of drawing time. When all the artwork is done, I send over my finished files. I think I actually ended up submitting it 2 days earlier in advance, so my method works. I just send over my PSD files via WeTransfer and just make sure everything in the files are labeled nicely and all of the layers are like, we have a bunch of separate layers so that the art director can move around elements as needed. I got a few minor revisions, but other than that, my job was done. Now that the book is out, oh wow, I'm really happy with how it came out. Of course, I'm always gonna be like my own worst critic and pick out the flaws and everything. With a short schedule, I couldn't take as much time as I would have liked on each page, and so I kind of feel like I rushed it really, especially towards the end. Or like looking back at some of the pages, I feel like I could have done some things differently or changed the composition up a little bit. Some of the characters could have been drawn a little bit neater as well. But again, that's just me being a nitpicky artist. Overall, I'm really proud of the work that I did on this, and I love that once again I get to draw a book where the characters are super diverse and reflect the world around us. I think that the envelope pages worked so well. Also, I've never worked on a novelty book before, and I think that the envelopes and inserts turned out so well. Anyway, that's it. How I illustrate my picture books and the whole picture book publishing process. Of course, my process for each of my books changes a little bit, so I would recommend that you check out my other videos on this topic because you might learn something else. If you like this series, please let me know, and I'll try to do some other ones as well, maybe covering my book Bilal Cooks Doll. That could be a fun one. Actually, if you enjoyed this video and you learned something new, please give it a like and also consider subscribing to my channel. As I mentioned before, I create tons of videos on what it's like being an illustrator, advice for artists, And more recently, I started posting studio vlogs, if you like those chill vibes. And if you think that I've missed anything, or if you think that I'm super wrong about something and you want to fight, then fight me, bro. Meet me in the comments box. As always, you can find my work at AnooshaSyed.com. You'll find all of my other picture books on there too, as well as other stuff that I've worked on. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Foxville_art, and I post art and other goodies there all the time. I also have an online store, which is just AnooshaSyed.com/shop, and I sell prints and stickers and pins and all sorts of other goodies. I think that's all I have for today. Yeah, if you see this book, Rise Up and Write It, in any bookstores, libraries, etc. If you ever buy this book, you know, thank you so much. But yeah, if you ever do purchase this book or you see it around, please snap a picture and tag me on Instagram. Please let me know. I love seeing that kind of stuff. And yeah, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye!